Verse 1 is where we'll be today. We're beginning with verse 1. We're coming towards the conclusion of 1 Corinthians, and St. Paul has kept this argument for last. It goes on for 58 verses, and it is about the resurrection of the dead. It begins with these words, also, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel. Now let's stop right there. What is the gospel? 1 Corinthians chapter 15 really incorporates the basis and center of the gospel. The word gospel literally means good news. There is good news, really good news concerning the bad news, the worst news. The worst news that humanity has is that from dust we are, and to dust we shall return. That's the bad news God informed Adam of. For you are dust, and you're simply going back to the dust. Adam, you were meant to be more than dust. I took you from the dust. I formed your body from the dust, God says. But then I breathed into you the breath of God, the quickening Spirit. Because spirit and dust merged together, you became a thinking, pondering, wondering, learning, speaking, expressing creature, a living spirit, a living soul. Body, soul, spirit. It's what I intended you to be, Adam. But because of something you've chosen to do, the spirit part of you has become somewhat dead. And now you'll go only to the dust as you came from the dust. And of course that speaks of Adam's body, but God makes no mention to Adam of an afterlife, of a place where his spirit might go or his soul might go and be with God. At this point, God does not even say that to Adam. He just says, you came from dust and now you're simply going back to dust. Nor does God mention to Adam that there will be a raising from the dust of your body again. That's the bad news, isn't it? Now comes the gospel, and it's good news. And the good news is death is not the end. There is something beyond death. There is now, because of Christ, the possibility that beyond death, as he was raised from the dead, so we will be raised from the dead. As the words of the prophets move through the Old Testament and finally explode into this idea, God had left Adam with only the bad news. Along comes Abraham, lives his life in faith, never calls himself righteous, but God calls him so. And we have this statement when Abraham dies, that he is in death gathered unto his fathers. As though somewhere in death there's a group of his ancestors, his people, and he's gathered unto them. And we have that expression used. It begins a Hebrew mindset. that there has to be something beyond life and death. As we read through Genesis, the afterlife still is not described to us. We come through the law of Moses, which gives very scant depiction of an afterlife, if at all. Only the vaguest, faintest allusion to it. Bad news still seems to reign. The wars of Joshua, all the dying, the falling cycles of the book of Judges, all the dying, and still not any real good news. And then we come into the poetry of David. And a few ideas only are expressed. David, who seemed to carry this old notion that there is life after death. When his little infant child dies, David had been fasting and praying in sackcloth and ashes that the baby, sick, might not die. And the child dies anyway. David rises. As soon as he gets the news that the child died, he rises and takes a shower and puts on clean clothes and even slaps on some perfume of some kind. He anoints himself, we're told. And his servants helping him dress, for he's king, you know. They say, Master, pardon us for asking. But most people, when a child dies, that's when they go into mourning and put on sackcloth and ashes. You did the sackcloth before the child dies, and now you're dressing yourself up in a celebratory way. This seems backwards. And David said to them, the child cannot come back to me, but I can go to him. Ooh, it just makes me shiver. That's like the first great statement of someone showing a certainty in an afterlife, a place to go to, stated in a definite way. David writes again, somewhat prophetically, about the Messiah, but maybe also about himself. You, O Lord, will not leave my soul. Of course, the King James Version of that says, in hell. Wrong translation, actually. He uses the word Sheol, which means the grave, the abode of the dead. You will not leave my soul in the grave, nor will you suffer your Holy One to see corruption. Somewhere around this time, some old writing was found that we now call the book of Job. An excellent dialogue play between Job and his friends. And perhaps the centerpiece of the argument between Job and his friends comes up at this place when Job had said, yes, everything goes wrong, everything falls apart, and nothing seems to be what it ought to be. Life produces only disappointments. Job had begun to curse and sorrow, cursed everything but God. But he cursed the day he was born. He cursed the night in which he had been conceived. He cursed even his mother's bosoms that had nourished him as a baby. He cursed the sun that shone over him on the day he was born and the moon that rose on the night he was conceived. And he said, there's no meaning in life. It's just that we're going to die. That's all. And in between birth and death, we face more sorrow than joy. In the middle of all this despair, as though Job had been digging down into his own soul, and all he could find was sorrow and trash and slag, and he reaches down, pulling out all of these statements of horror and despair, and then he gets to the bottom and grabs something and brings it up and looks at it, And it's that jewel at the bottom of the mine of his soul. And he cries out this, nevertheless, he says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and he will stand on the earth in the latter day, and my eye will see him. I'll behold him and not another. And as for this body of mine, though it go down to the grave, and even my skin and my inner bowels will be devoured by the worms, nevertheless, somehow, becoming only worm excrement, this flesh of mine will yet see God. What a statement. Though the worms crawl in and the worms crawl out, and the worms play pinochle on your snout, they eat your coat, they eat your hat, they crawl in skinny and crawl out fat. Well, even though that is ahead for us, and the horrors of death, death's worst, death's cobwebs and dust and winding sheets, and enclosure in a coffin, or cremation to ashes, the worst of death, nevertheless, there's something else out there, Job said. Somehow God will bring it all back together again. My flesh, Job said. And at the time he was saying it, he was covered with boils and some kind of sickness, and sitting in ashes himself, and his only these pussy sores that he had, his only hope was to dry them by rubbing ashes into them and then scraping them with a sharp edge of a piece of broken pottery. What misery he was in. And yet something came up in him. This is not the end of it all. Even this corruptible flesh is going to be raised up in some way in the presence of God, my Redeemer. Daniel writes a cryptic thing, that all they that sleep in the dust will rise. Daniel was saying this about the time his buddy Ezekiel, both Daniel and Ezekiel were in Babylon together. His buddy Ezekiel was having a strange vision of an after battlefield scene where thousands of bodies had just been left where they died on the battlefield, an army fallen somewhere out in one of Nebuchadnezzar's great battles, where the dead had just been left to be feasted upon by wild birds and crows and ants and jackals and hyenas. The bodies all gone, the flesh all gone, the bones withering in the sun, bleaching under the sun, grinning skulls, and then other animals tearing those skeletons apart, and pieces of bone lying around, scattered in this horrid scene. Ezekiel looked at it. Of course, this is a symbolic vision because he's talking about how Israel had fallen to nothing and been scattered. And the question God was asking Ezekiel, will it be possible? Would anybody believe you if you said that all that's been scattered, the nation of Israel, I can bring it back together and raise it up and make it strong again? In Ezekiel's symbolic dream about that question, he sees the winds of God blowing upon these scattered, broken skeletons, and they come back together again, each finding its place. Then another wind blows and flesh comes upon them, and then another wind blows and they stand up on their feet as Ezekiel prophesies to the wind. What's he prophesying? Other than that, death is not the end. There is life after death. Daniel agrees with this, saying, all they that sleep in the dust shall rise. We're getting towards the end of the Old Testament. We have not yet had one long passage detailing the certainty of the resurrection of the flesh. We only have those brief things I've mentioned. Somebody says, well, a lot of Jewish people today say Judaism is a religion without an afterlife. We don't believe in the afterlife. Well, they shouldn't say that because their ancient forebears certainly did. In 1 Kings 15, we'll get back to 1 Corinthians 15. I want you to look at something in 1 Kings 15, verse 13. 1 Kings 15:13. I want to point out something to you. And also Maacah, his mother, even her, he removed from being queen because she had made an idol in a grove, and Asa destroyed her idol and burnt it by the brook Kidron. You say, what in the world does that have to do with what Brother Pat's been talking about? I want to point out something to you. This Maacah was the granddaughter of Absalom. Absalom was David's rebellious son, whose maternal grandfather was the king of Geshur. When Absalom had to flee from a crime he committed, he went to his grandfather, the king of Geshur, and lived for 3 years. When he came back from exile, pardoned by his father, King David, Absalom now carried in him a religion that he learned from his grandfather. What religion was it? He kept it inside of himself. But he now wanted to, through subterfuge, rebellion, deceit, he wanted to become king of Israel, murder his father David. It's what he had in mind. Destroy all of his other half-brothers and make himself king and replace the worship of Jehovah with this worship that he had learned from his grandfather, Talmai, the king of Geshur. Are you following this story? Absalom's rebellion was worse than we think. Of course, Absalom was killed. He never got to be king, but he did leave a granddaughter on earth, and her name was Maacah. Solomon knew about her and warned throughout the Proverbs his son Rehoboam, boy, you will be king one day. Do not mess with that strange woman. He says it over and over again. There's a strange woman, and her ways are death and oblivion. Without hope. All who listen to her doctrine are in the depths of hell now. He says it over and over again to Rehoboam. As soon as King Solomon dies, Rehoboam is king, and the first thing he does is marry this woman, Maacah. And she takes over the kingdom. Rehoboam reigns for 17 years, a very weak reign. And in the meantime, this woman, Maacah, whom he had married, the strange woman, she takes over Jerusalem. Through Rehoboam's weakness and her bad counsel, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel leave and never come back again. Through her reign, you read about it in Rehoboam's reign, she brought in the Sodomites to set up their shrines all around the temple of God. In Rehoboam's weak reign, Judaism was becoming even worse than the golden calf worship that the other 10 tribes by then embraced, repudiating Jehovah altogether. Maacah had done all of this. But worst of all, she set up a grove and put an idol in it. Look at that word idol. It's mentioned twice. Now, in the English Bible, the word idol or idols or idolatry comes up hundreds of times. And they all have their translation from the Hebrew. They're all the same word, except this idol. You go to the Hebrew, there's a strange word. It's not the same word for idol you find everywhere else in the Bible. It's a very strange word, used only in this verse twice. The word is Miflet. The only time it appears in the Bible is in this verse. Miflet. Oh, it's different from an idol of Baal or an idol of Ashtoreth or a statue of, Isis or Osiris or one of the pagan gods or goddesses. This is different. Miflet. What does it mean? It means the double horror. An idol that simply represents the double horror. Miflet worship learned from old King Talmai and Jashur by Absalom, and now carried on by Absalom's granddaughter Maacah. Solomon's great-grandson Asa becomes king, and the first thing he does is take his mother Maacah and remove her from her position as an authority figure, a queen mother in Judah. Puts her in her own house and says, don't you ever come out of there, and there she'll die friendless and alone. And he goes into her place of worship where she had brought all of her sodomite priests to worship Miflet. Here's what we know about Miflet worship. It was worship of death itself. Now, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is going to be referring to this idea. Joel will refer to it, so will Jesus, so will John the Revelator. Miflet said that in the end, there will finally be nothing but darkness. The sun will burn into a cinder and go black as sackcloth of hair. The stars will fall from heaven. The moon will turn to blood and then disappear. And there will then be oblivion. Nothing. Jehovah, the God of light, had his beginning. He came out of darkness and has his light, but Jehovah and his light will one day end. And what will be left? Miflet, the goddess of nothingness. And they worship death. The idea that after life, there's nothing. There's nothing, and therefore, since nothing was in the beginning, and nothing is all that will be in the end, then nothingness, oblivion, is greater than substance, and even God will be swallowed up by it. The reason why that word is so rare in the Bible, the very fact that it horrified Asa, so that he has to destroy this thing and all that it represented. Well, why destroy it? I mean, isn't it true we all die and come to nothing? No, that's not true. Destroy this thing. Cut it in pieces. Burn it to ashes. Throw it in the river and let it be swept down to the sea. Why, Asa says? Because we will not accept that idea. Somehow there must be something beyond life and beyond death. It is this idea. Others might not have called it Miflet. They would have called it just oblivion. After death, there's nothing at all. Just darkness. That idea was taken hold by a group of Jews who called themselves Sadducees. There is no afterlife. There is no heaven, no hell. There's only the law of Moses that we must obey while we're alive on this earth, and continue it in our children and our grandchildren, so that when we die, we know they'll continue it in their brief lives. That's Mephibosheth. Solomon pondered about it in the book of Ecclesiastes as an old man. Could it be that we are really spirits? He asked it as a question. We are spirits and animals are not. Could it be, as the Levites tell us, that the soul of animals goes back into the dirt, but our spirits rise to God in heaven who gave them? Could it be? Who can prove it to me, Solomon asks. And could it be that we are just like the beasts and we all go to the same place? That the wise man is equal to the fool in that no matter how they live, both of them go to the same place. And is that all there is? That's Mephibosheth. Just wondering. Solomon must be writing, thinking as an old man, I heard my brother Absalom teaching this kind of stuff when I was a kid. Could he have been right? Of course, then Solomon comes along and says, no, he wasn't right. There must be a connection with God. There must be something beyond this life. I don't blame Solomon for pondering it. You probably have pondered it sometime. Is there really something beyond life and death? It comes down to this. I mean, Paul is going to point out there's really only two kinds of people on earth. Those who have a hope beyond death and those who do not. Back to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 1. I'm just giving you a setup. I will not finish this chapter today. I'm giving you a setup on what the argument is all about. In Paul's time, most educated Romans did not believe there was an afterlife, and their view was permeating the world. For those were crude and cruel days, and human flesh was cheap. We're told about those times of the Roman Empire. I'm still defining the word gospel, the idea of the good news versus the bad news. Finish this chapter today. I might not even finish this verse today. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 1. Thank you for taking that trip with me back to Maacah's time. It's the best way I know to point out the horror of the bad news. People who embrace the bad news. We came from nothing, we're going to nothing. All we know about our bodies is they came from the dust, yes, and they'll go back to the dust, yeah. There was nothing before and there'll be nothing after. We just came up by some kind of chance. My mother's womb, there was a little egg that had a tiny submicroscopic spiral of DNA, and then the tiny bit of something with a cell with DNA came from my father's body, and those two merged and spiraled together. Life and a spark happened in my mother's uterus, and then those DNA bits began to share with one another, and life came, and then they began to multiply and divide, multiply and divide, multiply and divide. Within a week or two, there's a tiny little cluster about like a thimble of cells, and in them was the shape of a nose and the shape of earlobes and the peculiar likeness of fingers that were somehow like the dad's and somehow like the mom's. And here I am at my age. I still look in the mirror and see my mother's eyes, but my dad's nose and chin. I've got my mother's bent little finger. That's from her family. Praise God. And I've got my dad's bow-legged shin bones, and I'm all mixed up between her and him. Where did this substance come from? A tiny little submicroscopic part of substance that came from my body, my father's body, began to mix in my mother's body, and he contributed nothing else. What became me, the 5 or 6 pound baby that I was when I was born, or 7 pounds. I don't remember what babies are supposed to weigh. First memory I have of my weight was I was about 5 at a doctor's, and they told me I weighed almost 50 pounds, I think. Somehow I had it in my mind that babies were probably then 20 or 30 pounds when they were born. But whatever that poundage was, it came from the dust. Because the 9 months my mother carried me, she ate food. Where does food come from? It's grown from the dirt. Somebody said, well, what if she ate meat? Animals have meat because they eat stuff that's grown from the dirt. It all comes from the dirt. And she ate it. And some of what she ate went to me. And all that dust transferred through plants and animal meat, and then my mother's body came in, became my substance. That 6.5 or 7 pound baby born was all made out of dust. But it's alive, though. There had to be something besides just substance. There had to be essence in it. I might have my grandmother's hair color, or my dad's, or my mother's eyes. I might have my dad's toenails and toe shape. I don't know. All of that came from earthly substance. But there's something else in me. I guess I was about 6 years old in the first grade, sitting in school, and something the nun said while she was teaching us just sparked my mind, and I began to think, you know, I'm me. That's my first recollection of really grasping my individual identity. Why do I look out of these eyes? I don't know how to express what my childish thoughts were, but I'm somebody different from anybody else. I look at a thing and see it. Do these other people see it the same way I see it? When I see red, I know what I'm talking about. Maybe they look at red and see a different color, but they just call it red, and we all think we're talking about the same thing. I see and think and smell and wonder about things in a different way than anybody else I know. I was becoming aware of my soul. I am me. Nobody else is me. I'm not just one of them. And boy, that way of being me, as opposed to being part of a group, that's been the curse of my life. I'm going to be an individual. I don't want to belong to anybody. I want to do my own thinking and wondering. Not say yes to some group or idea just because a crowd of people say so. I want to figure it out myself. And what was that? I was realizing that I was somebody that my soul and its ways were not inherited from my father and mother and not from the earth. It was something else. Come from somewhere else. God breathed into Adam the dust. He became a living soul. Not all living souls, not the living soul, but a living soul. An individual, essential being with perception and understanding. Grasping for understanding. With abilities that animals don't have. To wonder. To ponder, to consider. Am I making sense to anyone? There is something that came from somewhere else into you. You didn't just come from the dust. Your body did. And that's where your body will go. But there's something else that is you. The body is not really you, you know. It's just kind of the animal God gave you to ride around on while you're on this earth. St. Francis called his body Brother Ass. With that idea. I have to take care of this animal. I've got to wash it and clean it and clothe it and protect it and feed it. But it ain't me. Who I am is something else. Now, those who don't believe in the afterlife, who think we only came from oblivion and go back to oblivion, start to say Bolivia. We're not going to Bolivia, but they think we're going to oblivion. Have never been able to answer me this. What is then the human soul? There's another thing that the human soul does that animals don't get. That's the sense of time. That's why pain to us is more acute than it is to animals. I'm not saying animals don't feel severe pain. But it's only in the present moment. When we're in pain, we think how long we've been hurting, and we look to the past. That intensifies the pain we feel. And then we look ahead and think, how long do I have to continue this? And the sense of time, past and future, compounding the present, makes our pain more intense. The idea of past and future also makes our present joy more intense sometimes. Man, look what I've got now. I didn't have it yesterday. Animals can only think in the present. I'm hungry right now. I'm cold right now. I'm afraid right now. But they're unable to regard the past in the way we do, counting time backward. And certainly are unable to regard the future with hope. They only move into the future with instinct. But we're able to ponder. And if we ponder past and future, then we become more spiritual in our pondering, and we realize I'm never really living in the present. No animal's going to get this. A lot of people won't get it. But there is no present. You say, yeah, it is. Or right now, this moment. That moment passed while you were saying the word now. You can't experience the present. What you're experiencing is your past and your future blended together, moving you along. That's something that the human soul is able to do. If you become more experienced, or more spiritual rather, you begin to realize I'm not really even living in the past or the future. I'm an eternal being. I'm living in eternity. This is one of the things that salvation does for you. I'm still defining the good news versus the bad news. Moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel, the good news. What does Paul mean when he uses the word gospel? In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, let's go there. Paul wrote this letter to the Thessalonian church before he wrote his letter to the Corinthian church. Is this interesting to anyone? Or am I just a loudmouth ranter up here? Before he wrote to the Corinthian church, and by the way, in 1 Corinthians 15, he's going to give the Bible's most precise and literate, definite, absolute definition of the resurrection of the dead and the second coming of Jesus Christ. But he had first written about it briefly to the Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, beginning with verse 13, Brother Travis. But I, Paul says to the Thessalonians, I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep. That means those Christians in your church that have died. You know, Paul said, I came to the Thessalonian church and I preached them that you'll never really die if you accept Christ. Well, now some of them have died and have written a letter to Paul saying, you told us we'd never die. So Paul's writing to them saying, let me tell you what I meant by that. I wouldn't have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that ye sorrow not, even as others who have no hope. Right there is the big definition. Christian believers live in hope. Others do not. Like brute beasts, Paul will say elsewhere, they're simply living in the present, accompanied by the past and the future, just living between birth and death. They don't know, like the old song, Cotton-Eyed Joe, the refrain is, where did you come from, where did you go? Where do we come from? Where do we go? I don't know, Cotton-Eyed Joe. Who cares? We just got our work to do right now, and so why do we work? So we can eat. Why do we eat? So we can keep working. And why do we work? Well, so we can keep eating. Why do we eat? So we can keep working. We just eat to live and live to eat. That's all I know. And then it's over with. We're living in existence, but not in hope. Living in hope. Hope for what? Next verse, please. What kind of hope? For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so them also which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. When? Read on. For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent, which means go ahead of. We will not precede or go ahead of them which are asleep. Read on. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel. Who is the archangel? The prince of angels. He is. It'll be his voice as Prince of Angels who will shout, and with the trump of God. And the dead in Christ shall rise first. One more verse. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, or in the cosmos. And so shall we ever be with the Lord. Now that's all that Paul had written about this resurrection in any kind of description so far. These few verses to the Thessalonians. By the way, the Thessalonians didn't quite understand it. And he found out they didn't quite understand it. He had to write them 2 Thessalonians to straighten them out, because some of them thought Paul was saying the Lord's coming any day now, and they were quitting their jobs and not working and not renewing their insurance policies and not paying their debts. Don't have to pay because the Lord's coming. Paul said the Lord's coming. We got it right here in his letter. Paul had them write him a second letter, said, look, fellas, pay your bills. If you don't work, you don't eat. And yes, the Lord is coming, but not tomorrow. Before that great day of the Lord comes, and he lists a number of things that still would have to happen. So let's get on and be exemplary citizens. God's looking for spiritual fruit, not religious nuts. So much for 1 Thessalonians. Back to 1 Corinthians 15. I hope I'm not confusing you. I say the wrong words every now and then. Is this all right? Is this worth listening to? Back to that first verse. 1 Corinthians 15:1. Moreover, brethren, I declare unto you. Now, what he's going to be giving us is a long, what did I say? 58 verse chapter expanding on the 5 verses he had written to the Thessalonians about. I declare unto you the good news which I preached to you, which also you have received, and wherein you stand. And now that good news is, simply I'll repeat it, the belief that death is not the end. The further belief, here's where I was born, here's where I die. What'll be after I die? Eternity. But eternity doesn't begin when you die. Eternity not only has no end, it has no beginning. Where did you come from? Well, I came from the dust. I go back to the dust. Where were you before you came out of that dust? Something in you came from eternity. That spirit that you are that came from God was connected to that spiral of DNA in your mother's womb. While it grew, your spirit and soul waited in it. Then after you die, it's going to continue unless you kill your soul and spirit while you're on this earth. Something in you came from mom, something came from dad, but the real you came from God. Will you find your way back to God and eternity? This is the gospel. This is the hope wherein we stand. Romans have a baby that they don't want. Oh, it's a girl. We needed a boy. We've already got 3 girls in our family, can't feed them. We need some boys that can help Daddy work, you know. And Romans would kill their children by exposure. What does that mean? Just take the little infant out and lay it in the woods. Alive. It'll be dead by morning. Birds will already be picking at it. The rats will be at it. It'll disappear. What's left of it into the dirt sooner or later, and they think nothing of it. How many Romans did that? It was done everywhere in the empire. Paul was preaching in a Roman Empire city, Corinth, where people practiced that there. Well, it came from the dust, goes back to the dust. Big deal. Human flesh is cheap. First century Christians preaching in Rome after Paul, this was one of their biggest challenges, to teach the value of human life, the sanctity of human life. It took them 3 centuries to win out over mythlicetism. We didn't come from nothingness, and we're not going back to nothingness. We came from an eternal essence that we should get back to in eternity. What is eternity? I've heard preachers always ask, where will you spend eternity? You know, when they're making altar calls. Think of where you're going to spend eternity. And I'm always thinking, you don't spend eternity. Eternity can't be spent. To spend something means to come to the end of it. I don't care that they use the word. People know what they're saying, but I'm just being real technical here. Because it's not forever nothingness to forever nothingness. It's forever everythingness. Then after the trial of our lives on this earth, we should win it and go back to eternal everythingness. And this is the big difference between the gospel and the philosophies of man. They mock the gospel, you know. Got to close in a few minutes, and I still haven't finished verse 1, have I? Karl Marx wrote that religion is nothing more than the opiate of the common people. What do you mean by that? The opiate of the people. Well, common poor people can't afford alcohol or narcotics or, opiates to dull their pain. The common poor people in Russia, they can't afford that, so what do they use to dull their pain? Religion, foolish ideas, foolish hopes that we will live after we die. And that's the drug that gives them a little bit of joy in life, which is otherwise drudgery. That was his idea. Others took that idea. Yuri Gagarin, the first cosmonaut, first human in space, orbiting the earth. Of course, he was a Russian cosmonaut. When he got back, Russian reporters from Pravda, the national magazine, said, and cosmonaut Gagarin, did you see God or angels when you were up there? And he laughed. I saw nothing of God, nothing of heaven. I read about that. He chuckled. I read about that, and I thought, you idiot, you were seeing God. You were flying through heaven. You were beholding the stars in a clearer way than any of us have ever been able to do through our atmosphere looking at them. And you couldn't see God? The heavens declare the glory of God. And the firmament shows his handiwork. But that's the difference between those who live without hope and those who live in hope. And that's the difference between the good news and the bad news. Moses came to give us, and Paul's going to be going into this in this chapter. Moses came to give us more of Adam's bad news. Now you've got to obey the law, and if you don't, you'll die. The law will kill you. Oh, that's bad. That's even, this news gets badder and badder, Moses. Jesus came to preach the good news. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever simply believes on him shall not perish. And the word perish means fall into oblivion. Even in John 3:16, Jesus is declaring against Maacah's Mifletzeth horror philosophy. You believe in me, you will not perish into oblivion, but shall have instead everlasting life. Thank you for your attention this morning. Give Pastor James a hand as he comes.
So I'll go ahead and stand to our feet. You get kind of drawn into the story, don't you? All of a sudden,